Nothing prepares you for watching everything you love disappear beneath the water. In one terrible night, the floods of Vestfjord took homes, families, and dreams that had been built over generations. Young Brynja was swept away, trying to save her healing herbs, and everyone believed she was gone forever. But giant Viking warrior Jorund saw something floating in the dark water, a small figure clinging to broken wood. When he pulled her into his boat, neither of them knew this rescue would change their lives completely. Jorund was known for his fierce temper and battle scars, not for gentle words or kindness. Yet something about this quiet healer made him want to protect rather than fight. What happens when a man built for war meets a woman dedicated to healing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning before the floods came, Brynja had knelt in her garden as she did every dawn, fingers gentle among the chamomile and yarrow that grew wild along the stone borders her grandmother had laid 40 years past. The herbs whispered secrets in the early light, which leaves held the strongest medicine, where to find the rarest blooms that could ease a fever or calm a restless heart. At 23, she had inherited more than her grandmother's cottage. She carried the weight of 3 generations of healing knowledge. Passed down through careful hands and patient teaching, her father, Aldrich, had been the village's respected healer until age bent his back and clouded his sight. Now he spent his days by the hearth, sorting dried roots and sharing stories of the old ways with anyone willing to listen. "The land tells us what we need," he would say, watching Brynja prepare her morning rounds. "But first, we must learn to hear its voice." Vestfjord was a village that understood the rhythm of seasons, where families had worked the same plots of land for generations, and children grew up knowing which stars guided the fishing boats home. The settlement nestled in a valley where 3 rivers converged, their waters usually gentle enough for children to wade across on summer afternoons. Houses built of stone and timber lined the main path, each one telling the story of the family within. The baker's cottage, with its wide chimney that perfumed the air with fresh bread. The blacksmith's forge, where sparks danced late into the evening. The weaver's workshop, where colorful threads hung like captured rainbows. Brynja moved through this world with quiet purpose, her leather satchel always at her side, filled with carefully prepared remedies and tools of her trade. She knew every door in the village, every face that might need her care. Old Magnus, whose joints ached in the dampness. Young Astrid, whose first child was due before winter's end. The fishermen who returned with cuts and bruises from nets and rocky shores. Each person carried their own story of pain and healing, and Brynja had learned to read these stories in the lines around tired eyes and the way someone held their shoulders against old hurts. But it was the children who brought her the greatest joy. They would follow her along the forest paths, chattering like birds as she gathered mushrooms and wild herbs. She taught them which berries were safe to eat and how to recognize the plants that could heal or harm. "Every growing thing has purpose," she would tell them, just as her grandmother had told her. "Our job is to understand that purpose and use it wisely." The cottage where she lived sat on the village's edge, close enough to the forest to gather what she needed, near enough to the river to draw fresh water for her preparations. Inside, bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of lavender and mint. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of ointments, tinctures, and powders that could ease everything from headaches to heartbreak. Her grandmother's mortar and pestle sat on the wooden table, where Brynja spent her evenings grinding roots and leaves, following recipes that had been perfected over decades of careful practice. On the other side of the valley, where the forest grew thick and wild, Jorund lived a very different kind of life. His dwelling was more shelter than home, a sturdy structure built for function rather than comfort, hidden among ancient oaks where few villagers ventured. At 31, he stood taller than most men and carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who had learned that the world could turn dangerous without warning. The scars that marked his arms and face told stories he rarely shared, Some came from battles fought in distant lands when he had sailed with crews seeking glory and gold. Others were reminders of harder lessons, the price of trust given too easily, the cost of mercy shown to those who had none to give in return. His left hand bore the mark where a blade had nearly severed 2 fingers. His right shoulder carried the memory of an axe that had come too close to ending everything. But the deepest wounds were the ones that couldn't be seen. Jorund had returned to Vestfjord 3 years ago, not as the eager young man who had left to seek his fortune, but as someone who had learned that victory often tasted like ash, and that the strongest warriors were sometimes the most broken. The other villagers gave him space, uncertain whether to treat him as the boy they remembered or the stranger he had become. He kept to himself mostly, appearing in the village only when necessary, to trade furs for grain, to repair his tools at the forge, to buy supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. The blacksmith Einar was one of the few who spoke to him directly, remembering the friendship they had shared as boys. "You carry too much on your shoulders," Einar would say, hammering red-hot iron into shape. "A man can't live like a ghost forever, but ghosts were easier than explanations." Jorund had seen things that peaceful villages couldn't understand, the way men could change when death walked among them, how quickly civilization could crumble when survival became the only law. He had been good at that kind of life, perhaps too good. The strength that had kept him alive in foreign battles felt heavy and unnecessary in a place where the greatest conflicts involved disputes over property lines and fishing rights. Still, he watched over the village in his own way. When wolves came down from the mountains in the deep winter, Jorund's tracks could be found circling the settlement, and the pack always moved on without taking any livestock. When storms threatened the fishing boats, he would quietly check the harbor, making sure the vessels were properly secured. He asked for no thanks and expected no recognition. It was simply what he did, the way another man might tend a garden or mend a roof. The night the rains began, Brynja was in her cottage, grinding willow bark by candlelight. She had been treating young Henrik for a fever, and his mother had asked for extra medicine to see him through the worst of it. The first drops against her window sounded gentle, almost welcoming after the dry heat of late summer. Rain meant full water barrels and thriving herbs, streams running clear and strong. But as the hours passed, the gentle pattering became a steady drumming, then a relentless pounding that seemed to shake the very walls. Brynja set aside her work and stepped outside, pulling her cloak tight against the downpour. The air felt different, heavy and electric, charged with something she couldn't name. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the swollen streams that already ran faster than she had ever seen them. In his forest dwelling, Jorund stood in his doorway, watching the water levels with growing concern. He had seen storms in many lands, had weathered tempests at sea that could swallow ships whole. This felt like those moments before the ocean revealed its true power, a held breath before the chaos began. The rain continued through the night and into the next day, then the day after that. What had started as welcome relief became something else entirely. The 3 rivers that gave Vestfjord its character began to merge, their boundaries blurring as water spread beyond their ancient banks. Gardens became ponds, paths became streams, and still the rain fell without mercy. By the 3rd day, panic had begun to replace concern. Families moved their belongings to upper floors and attic spaces. The village elders gathered to discuss evacuation routes, though none had experience with floods of this magnitude. Children pressed their faces to windows, watching their familiar world transform into something strange and frightening. Brynja worked tirelessly, helping families secure their homes and treating those injured in the hasty preparations. Her herb garden was already underwater, 3 generations of careful cultivation disappearing beneath the rising tide. But she couldn't think about that loss, not when others needed her help. She filled her leather satchel with every medicine she could carry, knowing that whatever came next, people would need healing. Jorund moved through the chaos like a man accustomed to crisis. He helped evacuate the lowest houses, carrying elderly villagers to higher ground with the same calm efficiency he had once used to rescue wounded comrades from battlefields. He spoke little, but his presence brought comfort to families who had watched their neighbors struggle with fear and uncertainty. As the fourth night fell, the water had claimed the village's heart. The main path was a river, the baker's ovens cold and flooded, the forge silent under feet of churning brown water. Those who remained huddled in the few buildings still above the floodline, sharing what food they had and telling stories to keep fear at bay. It was during this longest night that fate decided to reveal its hand. The old dam upstream, built by their grandfathers from stone and timber, finally surrendered to the pressure it was never meant to bear. The sound it made when it broke was like thunder, but deeper, more final. A wall of water rushed down the valley, carrying with it the last illusions that this was just another storm to be weathered. Brynja had been checking on the wounded in the upper room of the inn when the wave struck. She saw it coming through the window, a dark wall moving faster than a horse could run, swallowing everything in its path. There was no time to warn anyone, no time to do anything but watch as her world disappeared beneath the hungry flood. The morning after the dam broke, Vestfjord existed only in memory. Where houses had stood for generations, only rooftops peaked above the churning water like the bones of some massive creature. The silence was the worst part. No voices calling across the square, no sounds of daily life, just the relentless whisper of water finding new places to claim. Brynja had spent the night clinging to the inn's roof beam, her legs cramped and her fingers numb from gripping the rough wood. Around her, other survivors huddled in small groups, sharing body warmth and speaking in hushed voices about the missing. Old Henrik was gone, swept away when the wave took his house. The baker's family had last been seen climbing toward their attic. But that building now lay somewhere beneath 15 feet of muddy water. As dawn broke grey and cold, the survivors began the grim task of assessing what remained. 15 people had made it to the inn's upper floor. Perhaps 20 more clung to other buildings scattered across what had once been their valley. But Vestfjord had been home to nearly 200 souls. And the math was too terrible to speak aloud. "We need to get down to the water," said Leif, the village elder, whose white beard was now stained with mud and despair. "See if anyone else made it through the night. The current's still too strong," warned Einar the blacksmith, his massive frame somehow diminished by the catastrophe around them. "Anyone who tries to swim in that will be swept away like leaves." Brynja looked down at the brown torrent that had swallowed her world. Somewhere beneath those waters lay her cottage, her grandmother's mortar and pestle, 3 generations of carefully preserved healing knowledge. But even as grief tried to claim her, she felt the familiar pull of duty. People were hurt, people were missing, and she was still a healer. "My medicines," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet despair. "I left them downstairs when the water rose. If anyone's injured," Brynja no. Astrid, the pregnant woman whose baby was due any day, reached out to touch her arm. "It's too dangerous," but Brynja was already calculating. The inn's lower floor was flooded, but if she could reach the back room where she'd stored her supplies, she might salvage something. The leather satchel that never left her side contained only basic remedies, enough for cuts and headaches. But not for the injuries that surely awaited in the aftermath of such destruction. She moved toward the stairs before anyone could stop her, hiking up her sodden skirts and testing each step. The water had risen to the 7th stair, lapping hungrily at the wood. It was cold enough to steal her breath, but she forced herself down, feeling for the familiar doorway that led to the storage room. The current was stronger than she'd expected. What looked like still water from above revealed itself as a steady flow that tugged at her legs, trying to pull her off balance. She pressed against the wall, inching toward where she remembered the shelves to be, her hands searching blindly beneath the surface. Her fingers found the familiar texture of oiled leather, her larger medicine bag, the one she carried on longer journeys to distant farms. She pulled it up, testing its weight. Still sealed, still dry. Relief flooded through her as she turned to make her way back to the stairs. That's when the current caught her. She'd grown careless, thinking herself safe so close to the stairs. But the water had carved new channels through the inn's lower floor, creating hidden currents that moved with vicious speed. Her foot slipped on something, debris maybe, or just the treacherous mud that coated everything, and suddenly she was falling, the medicine bag flying from her hands as she plunged into the churning water. The flood took her like a living thing, eager and hungry. She surfaced once, gasping and choking, her heavy skirts dragging her down. The inn's doorway rushed past, then the collapsed wall of what had been the cooper's shop. She tried to swim, but the current was faster than any river she'd known, and her waterlogged clothes made every movement a battle. Above the roar of the flood, she could hear voices calling her name, but they grew fainter with each passing moment. She managed to grab a piece of floating timber, part of someone's roof beam, and pulled herself halfway out of the water. The wood was slick and unstable, but it kept her head above the surface as the flood carried her away from everything she'd ever known. Terror gave way to a strange clarity. She was going to die. The realization came not with panic, but with a peculiar sadness. Her grandmother's knowledge would die with her. The herbs she'd been cultivating, the remedies she'd been perfecting, the trust the village had placed in her healing hands, all of it would disappear beneath the flood along with everything else. She thought of her father, probably dead in the ruins of their cottage. She thought of Astrid, whose baby would be born into a world without proper medicine. She thought of all the small kindnesses she'd never have the chance to give, all the hurts she'd never heal. The timber she clung to struck something solid, another piece of debris, and spun her around. For a moment, she saw where the flood had taken her. She was beyond the village now, carried into the wider valley where the water spread like a vast lake, dotted with the remains of what had once been farms and forests. In the distance, she could see higher ground, but it might as well have been another world. Her strength was fading. The cold had seeped into her bones, and her fingers were losing their grip on the smooth wood. Soon she would slip beneath the surface and join all the others the flood had claimed. At least it would be quick. At least she wouldn't have to watch her world die piece by piece. That's when she heard the splash of oars cutting through water. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, offering false hope in her final moments. But the sound came again. Steady, purposeful strokes moving against the current. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper above the flood's roar. A shadow fell across her, blocking the grey morning light. She looked up to see the hull of a small boat, and above it, a figure she recognized even through her exhaustion and despair. Jorund sat at the oars, his scarred face grim with concentration, as he fought to keep his craft steady in the treacherous current. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I've got you." He shipped one oar and reached down, his large hand finding her wrist with surprising gentleness. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something there she'd never noticed before. Not just the hardness she'd expected, but a deep well of understanding, as if he knew exactly what it meant to fight for survival in a world that offered no mercy. With one powerful motion, he pulled her from the water and into the boat, her soaked body landing in a heap at his feet. She lay there gasping like a landed fish, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of being alive. Above her, Jorund had already resumed rowing, his strokes steady and sure as he guided them toward a distant spit of land that rose above the flood. "My bag," she managed to whisper. "My medicines, they're gone." He glanced down at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're alive," he said simply. "Everything else can be replaced." But even as relief washed over her, Brynja knew that nothing would ever be the same. The flood had taken more than houses and possessions. It had swept away the life she'd known, the role she'd inhabited, the certainty that had guided her steps. She was no longer the village healer, with her cottage full of remedies and her garden full of wisdom. She was just another survivor, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. As Jorund rowed them towards safety, she closed her eyes and tried not to think about what came next. For now it was enough to be breathing, enough to feel the solid wood of the boat beneath her. Tomorrow's questions could wait until tomorrow came. The island where Jorund brought her was barely more than a hill poking above the floodwaters, crowned with a cluster of pine trees that had somehow escaped the devastation. As he pulled the boat onto the muddy shore, Brynja tried to stand and immediately discovered that her legs had forgotten how to support her weight. She sank back down, shivering uncontrollably despite the wool cloak Jorund had wrapped around her shoulders. "Easy," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "The cold gets into your bones. Takes time to shake it out." He moved with practiced efficiency, pulling supplies from the boat, a thick blanket, a water skin, strips of dried meat wrapped in oiled cloth. Everything was dry, she noticed. Even in the chaos of the flood, he had prepared for survival with the thoroughness of someone who understood that death waited for the careless. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, her teeth chattering as he built a small fire with kindling he'd kept wrapped in waterproof leather. "Since before dawn. Started from the high ground when I saw the dam go." He struck flint to steel, coaxing sparks into the dry grass he'd nested among the sticks. "Figured there might be survivors to pull out." The casual way he said it made her study his face in the growing firelight. "How many others?" "You're the first I've found alive." He didn't meet her eyes when he said it, but she caught the slight tightness around his mouth that spoke of other discoveries, darker ones. As warmth began to seep back into her body, Brynja became aware of other discomforts. Her hands were scraped raw from clinging to the timber, and something sharp had cut her leg during her time in the water. She tried to examine the wound, but the torn fabric of her skirt was plastered to her skin with mud and blood. "Let me see," Jorund said, noticing her struggle. She hesitated. In the village, propriety mattered. An unmarried woman didn't show her bare legs to a man, especially not one with Jorund's reputation. But they weren't in the village anymore. The flood had washed away more than buildings. It had swept aside the small conventions that governed normal life. The cut ran along her shin, not deep, but jagged, with debris embedded in the wound. She winced as Jorund examined it by firelight, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he turned her leg to catch the light. "Needs cleaning," he said. "And stitching, probably. I could do it myself if I had my supplies." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Without her medicines, without her tools, she felt useless. What good was a healer who couldn't heal? Jorund reached into his pack and withdrew a leather roll that he unfolded to reveal an assortment of tools: a sharp knife, curved needles, thin cord, small pots of what looked like salve. It was a field surgeon's kit, she realized, designed for treating battle wounds, far from any healer's cottage. "You know medicine?" she asked, surprised. "Enough to keep myself alive." He selected a needle and began threading it with practiced movements. Learned it the hard way, mostly. As he worked to clean the wound, she found herself studying his hands. They were scarred and calloused, marked by years of holding weapons and ropes and tools. But his touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he understood that flesh was fragile and pain was something to be minimized whenever possible. "This will hurt," he warned, and she nodded, biting her lip as he began to stitch the wound closed. His technique was efficient rather than elegant, but the stitches were straight and even, and he worked quickly to spare her unnecessary discomfort. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain. "War teaches you many things. How to kill, mostly, but also how to keep people alive when killing is all around you." He tied off the final stitch and reached for a small pot of salve. "Your leg will heal clean if you keep it dry." She almost laughed at that. Keep it dry, when they were surrounded by floodwater with no shelter but a few pine trees. But something in his tone told her he was already planning for that, already thinking ahead to solutions she couldn't see. As if reading her thoughts, he gestured toward the trees. "There's a platform up there. Built it last summer as a hunting blind. It's small, but it's dry and defensible." She followed his gaze and saw it, a wooden platform nestled among the thick branches, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It was maybe 15 feet off the ground, accessible only by rope or by someone strong enough to climb the rough bark of the pine trunk. "I can't climb that," she said. suddenly feeling the full weight of her helplessness. "I know." He was already rigging a rope around her waist, fashioning a harness from cord and leather. "I'll pull you up." The ascent was undignified and frightening, but Jorund managed it with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything else. Soon, she found herself on a platform barely large enough for 2 people, but equipped with an oiled tarp for shelter and a wooden chest that contained more supplies than she would have expected. "You planned for this," she said, looking around at the preparations. "I planned for everything." He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Learn not to trust that things will stay the way they are." As night fell, they shared his dried meat and discussed what came next. The flood would recede eventually, but it might take weeks. Other survivors would need help, if any could be found. And eventually, someone would have to make the difficult journey to the nearest settlement to bring aid. "I should go," Brynja said, "to find help." "I know the region better than most," Jorund shook his head. "You're injured. And traveling alone through country like this." He gestured toward the water that stretched endlessly in all directions. "It's not safe." "Then what? We wait here until the water goes down? People might be dying while we sit in this tree." She saw something flicker across his face. Frustration, maybe, or the pain of old memories. "I've seen what happens when you try to save everyone," he said quietly. "Sometimes the best you can do is save who you can and accept that it has to be enough." The words hung between them in the darkness, heavy with implications she didn't fully understand. But she heard the experience in them, the hard-won wisdom of someone who had faced impossible choices and lived with the consequences. "In the morning," he said finally, "we'll look for others. But carefully, smart. No good comes from getting yourself killed trying to be a hero." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was finally claiming her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made even thinking an effort. When Jorund offered her the larger share of blankets, she was too tired to protest about propriety. As she drifted towards sleep, she felt him settle beside her, close enough to share warmth, but careful not to touch without permission. In the village, such proximity would have caused scandal. Here it was simply survival. The flood had changed the rules, and she was beginning to understand that adapting to those changes might be the only way to live through what came next. Brynja woke to the sound of voices drifting across the water. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then Jorund's hand touched her shoulder. "Warm, solid, real, quiet," he whispered. "There's a boat out there." She peered through the pine branches and saw it in the early morning mist, a makeshift raft carrying 3 figures, moving slowly through the debris-choked water. Even from a distance, she could see their desperate movements, the way they searched the floating wreckage for signs of life or salvageable supplies. "They're from the village," she said, recognizing the shape of the raft as pieces of the old dock lashed together with rope. "We have to help them." Jorund was already moving, but his caution was evident in every gesture. "Stay here. I'll bring them over." "No." She struggled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her stitched leg. "They'll be frightened if they see only you." "They know me. Trust me." He paused, and she saw him weighing the wisdom of her words against his instinct to keep her safe. Finally, he nodded. "Stay behind me, then. And if something feels wrong, you get back up this tree immediately." They climbed down together, Jorund lowering her carefully before dropping to the muddy shore himself. He pushed his boat into the water and rowed toward the raft. Brynja huddled in the stern, wrapped in his cloak. As they drew closer, she recognized the survivors. Einar the blacksmith, his wife Sigrid, and young Finn. Barely 16 and one of the village's most promising fishermen. They looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed and exhausted, their clothes still soaked from days in the flood. "Brynja." Sigrid's voice cracked with relief. "We thought you were dead. We saw you swept away from the inn. Jorund pulled me out," she said simply, watching their faces carefully. She had expected gratitude, but what she saw instead was a complex mixture of relief and something else, suspicion perhaps, or the wariness that came from desperation. "We've been searching for survivors," Einar said, his powerful arms barely able to manage the crude paddle he'd fashioned from a broken plank. "Found old Magnus clinging to his chimney. He lasted 2 days before he stopped, unable to finish." "How many others?" Jorund asked. "Maybe a dozen, scattered across the high points. But supplies are running low. Clean water, food, medicine." Einar's eyes fixed on Brynja with desperate hope. "Your healing supplies, did any survive?" The question hit like a physical blow. She thought of her cottage beneath the water, her grandmother's carefully preserved knowledge lost forever. "No," she said quietly. "Everything's gone." The devastation on their faces was almost worse than her own loss. These people had depended on her, had built their sense of security around knowing that Brynja could fix what was broken, heal what was hurt. Now she was just another survivor, as helpless as anyone else. "We need to gather everyone in one place," Jorund said, his voice cutting through their despair with practical necessity. "Pool what resources we have. Figure out who has what skills." Finn spoke up for the first time, his young voice shaky but determined. "There's a group on the hill near the old watchtower. Maybe 8 people. They've got some food, but they're arguing about rationing, about what to do next." Brynja felt a familiar stir of purpose. Healing wasn't just about medicines, it was about bringing people together, helping communities function when crisis threatened to tear them apart. "We should go to them," she said. "All of us together," but Sigrid shook her head. "They won't listen to us. Not anymore. Too many people making decisions, too many voices. It's chaos up there." Jorund had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward. "What kind of chaos?" Einar's expression darkened. "Accusations. People saying others aren't doing their share or that someone's hoarding supplies. Young Olaf tried to take charge, but he's never led anything bigger than a fishing crew. And that trader, Bjarni, he's claiming salvage rights on anything valuable that floats by." "People are scared," Brynja said softly. "When you lose everything, you start looking for someone to blame, someone to control." She caught Jorund's eye and saw understanding there. He knew about leadership under pressure, about what happened to people when survival was at stake. The skills that made him a feared warrior might be exactly what these survivors needed, but she also knew the villagers' wariness of him. They would have to approach this carefully. "We'll go to them," Jorund said finally. "But not as refugees asking for help, as people bringing solutions." They spent the next hour working together, combining their resources and planning their approach. Jorund's boat could carry more people and supplies than the makeshift raft. His hunting platform provided a model for shelter that others could replicate. Most importantly, his calm competence offered a counterpoint to the panic that seemed to be consuming the other survivors. But it was Brynja who suggested their strategy. "Let me talk to them first," she said. "They know me as their healer. If I present you as someone who can help us organize, who has the skills we need to get through this, they might listen." "And if they don't?" Jorund asked. She thought of her grandmother, who had navigated village politics with the same careful attention she gave to mixing medicines. "Then we help anyway." People in crisis don't always know what they need, but they know when they're being helped. As they approached the hill where the survivors had gathered, Brynja could see the truth of Sigrid's words. The group was fragmenting, scattered across different areas of the high ground, each small cluster jealously guarding whatever supplies they'd managed to salvage. Voices carried across the water, arguments about fairness, accusations about hoarding, the kind of bitter disputes that arose when fear overwhelmed community. "They're going to destroy themselves," Finn said quietly. "No," Brynja replied, drawing strength from a certainty she hadn't felt since the flood began. "We're going to help them remember who they are." Jorund's hand found hers briefly, a gesture of support that sent unexpected warmth through her. For the first time since losing everything, she felt like a healer again, not because she had medicines or tools, but because she had something more important. She had hope, and she had a partner who understood that sometimes healing meant building something new from the wreckage of what came before. The scene that greeted them at the survivors' camp was worse than Brynja had feared. What should have been a unified effort to rebuild had devolved into petty squabbles and hoarding. Bjarni, the traveling trader who had been in Vestfjord when the flood struck, had claimed the highest spot on the hill and surrounded himself with salvaged goods, blankets, tools, even food that rightfully belonged to the families who had lost everything. "You want supplies?" he called out as Brynja approached. "Then you trade for them, same as anyone else. I pulled these things from the water with my own hands." Astrid sat apart from the others, her pregnancy now visibly advanced, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Around her, 3 women tried to comfort children who cried for homes that no longer existed. The men had gathered in their own cluster, arguing in low, angry voices about leadership and priorities. Brynja. Astrid struggled to her feet, relief flooding her features. "Thank the gods you're alive." "The baby. It's coming soon, maybe days, and we have nothing. No clean linens, no hot water, no—" She stopped, seeing the truth in Brynja's expression. "I lost everything too," Brynja said softly. "But we'll manage. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without fancy preparations." It was a brave front, but inside, her stomach churned with anxiety. Childbirth was dangerous under the best circumstances. Here, with no proper shelter and no medical supplies, a dozen things could go wrong. She pushed the fear down and focused on what she could control. Jorund had hung back during her reunion with the villagers, but she could feel his presence behind her, solid, reassuring, ready to step in if needed. When young Olaf, who had apparently appointed himself leader, finally noticed him, the reaction was immediate. "What's he doing here?" Olaf's voice carried across the camp, making conversations stop and heads turn. "We have enough mouths to feed without taking in outsiders." The irony wasn't lost on Brynja. Jorund, who had grown up in this valley, who had spent years protecting its people from dangers they never knew existed, was being called an outsider by a fisherman barely out of his teens. "He saved my life," she said clearly, making sure her voice carried to everyone present. "And he has skills we need if we're going to survive this." "What skills?" demanded Bjarni. "Killing? We don't need more violence here." Jorund stepped forward then, his movement careful and non-threatening, but his presence seemed to fill the space around him. "I know how to build shelter that will last, how to purify water, how to preserve food for winter." His voice was calm, factual. "And I know how to organize people so work gets done instead of argued about." The silence that followed was filled with tension, but also calculation. These people were desperate, even if pride made them reluctant to admit it. They had been surviving day to day, but winter was coming, and none of them had planned beyond their immediate needs. It was Einar who broke the standoff. "Show us," he said simply. What followed was a demonstration that gradually transformed the mood of the entire camp. Jorund moved among the survivors, not commanding but suggesting, not taking charge but offering solutions. He showed them how to weave pine boughs into windbreaks, how to dig drainage channels that would keep their sleeping areas dry, how to build communal cooking fires that conserved fuel while feeding everyone. But it was his quiet conversation with Bjarni that impressed Brynja most. Instead of confronting the traders hoarding directly, Jorund approached it as a logistics problem. "You've got good instincts for salvage," he told the older man. "But storage is just the first step. We need someone who can coordinate distribution, make sure supplies go where they're needed most." By framing it as a promotion rather than a challenge to his authority, Jorund turned Bjarni from an obstacle into an ally. Within hours, the trader was organizing inventory and establishing fair rationing systems, proud of his new role as supply master. Brynja watched this transformation with growing amazement. She had seen Jorund's gentleness in their private moments, but this was something else, a kind of leadership that worked by understanding what people needed, not just what they said they wanted. As the day wore on, she found herself working alongside him in ways that felt natural, despite their brief acquaintance. When he built a more elaborate shelter for Astrid, she gathered soft materials for bedding. When he showed the men how to construct fishing weirs in the shallow water, she organized the women to process whatever they caught. "You're good at this," she told him, during a brief rest. Watching him patiently explain knot-tying techniques to young Finn. War teaches you about logistics, he replied. How to keep people alive when everything's trying to kill them. It's not so different from this, but Brynja thought it was very different. War was about defeating enemies, imposing your will through force. What Jorund was doing here was about building something new, creating community from chaos. It required a different kind of strength, one that lifted others up instead of tearing them down. That evening, as they sat around a communal fire, sharing the day's catch, something had shifted in the group dynamic. People were talking to each other instead of at each other. Plans were being made, work assignments distributed fairly. When someone mentioned the approaching winter, it was with concern but not panic. We'll need to think about permanent shelter soon, Einar said. Something more substantial than lean-tos. There's good building timber upriver, offered one of the farmers. If the water drops enough to reach it, stone from the old foundations, added another. We could salvage it, build better than before. Brynja felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to them planning not just survival, but renewal. These were her people, shaped by generations of working together, of caring for each other through hard times. The flood had scattered them temporarily, but their essential nature remained. Later, as the fire died down and people settled into their shelters, she found herself walking with Jorund along the water's edge. The flood was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris, but also possibility. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did today. Not just for me, but for all of them. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the water toward where Vestfjord had once stood. I used to think strength was about standing alone, he said finally, about not needing anyone else. But watching you today, seeing how you care for people. He stopped as if the words were too difficult to speak. What? She prompted gently. Maybe real strength is about knowing when to let others help, when to be part of something bigger than yourself. In the moonlight reflected on the floodwaters, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It wasn't the face of the feared warrior the villagers whispered about. It was the face of a man who had spent too long carrying burdens alone, finally discovering what it meant to share them. 3 weeks after the flood, their makeshift community had found a rhythm. The water continued its slow retreat, revealing the skeleton of Vestfjord beneath layers of mud and debris. Each day brought new discoveries, a tool that could be salvaged, a building foundation that remained intact. Sometimes the heartbreaking remnants of a life that had been swept away. Brynja had established herself as the unofficial keeper of morale, moving between the shelters each morning to check on everyone's well-being. Without her medicines, she had learned to heal with words, with presence, with the simple act of bearing witness to grief and fear. It was a different kind of medicine, but no less necessary. Astrid's condition had everyone worried. The baby had dropped lower, and her contractions came in waves throughout each day, never quite developing into true labor, but serving as constant reminders that the birth was imminent. The women had done what they could to prepare, gathering soft moss for bedding, boiling water whenever fuel allowed, fashioning rough tools from salvaged metal. I keep thinking about my mother, Astrid confided to Brynja as they sat together one afternoon, watching the children play in the receding shallows. She had 5 babies, lost 2 in childbirth. Always said the difference was having skilled hands to help. Brynja took her friend's hand, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Women's bodies know what to do. And you're strong, Astrid. Stronger than you think, but privately she worried. Astrid was small-framed, and this was her first child. In the village, she would have had the assistance of the experienced midwife, along with Brynja's herbs to ease pain and prevent bleeding. Here, they would have to trust in luck and prayer. It was Jorund who offered an unexpected solution. He approached Brynja one evening as she sat mending clothes by firelight, his expression thoughtful. "There's something I should tell you," he said, settling beside her. "About the birthing process. I've helped with difficult deliveries before." She looked up from her needlework, surprised. "Where?" On the ships. Sometimes we'd pick up refugees, families fleeing wars or famines. When you're at sea for weeks, babies don't wait for convenient timing. His voice carried the weight of memory. Lost some, saved others. Learned what works and what doesn't. The revelation shifted something in her understanding of him. She had seen his gentleness with injuries, his careful attention to medical needs, but this spoke to something deeper, a man who had chosen to learn life-giving skills in a profession devoted to death. "Will you help when her time comes?" she asked. "If she'll have me. If you think it's right." Brynja considered this. Traditionally, men were excluded from the birthing chamber, but tradition was another casualty of the flood. What mattered now was skill and experience, regardless of who possessed it. "We'll ask her," she decided. "Let her choose." The conversation was interrupted by shouts from the water's edge. Vin had returned from his daily scouting expedition, and his excited calls drew everyone from their shelters. "People!" he shouted, pointing across the water. "Survivors coming from the east!" They could see them in the distance, a small group moving slowly across the muddy landscape, supporting each other as they navigated the treacherous terrain. As they drew closer, Brynja recognized faces from the outlying farms, people she had visited on her longer healing journeys. But these survivors brought disturbing news. "It's not just our valley," reported Henrik, an elderly farmer whose weathered face spoke of decades battling the elements. The whole region's flooded, rivers backed up for miles, crops destroyed, livestock drowned. "Some places there's nothing left at all. What about Nordvik?" asked Einar, referring to the larger settlement 2 days' walk from Vestfjord. "Surely they escaped the worst of it." Henrik shook his head grimly. "Nordvik's gone, swept clean. We passed through 3 days ago, nothing but foundation stones and debris." The silence that followed this news was heavy with implications. They had been hoping that help would eventually come from the larger settlements, that their isolation was temporary. Now it seemed they might be truly on their own, perhaps for seasons to come. "We need to think differently then," Jorund said quietly. "Not about surviving until help arrives, but about building something that can last." That night, as the expanded group huddled around their fires, discussions took on a new urgency. If they were truly isolated, they needed to plan for winter, for spring planting, for all the complex necessities of a permanent settlement. "We could rebuild in the same place," suggested Olaf. "The foundations are still there." "Mostly. Too close to the floodplain," countered Henrik. "Those waters could rise again. We need higher ground." Jorund had been quiet during most of the discussion, but now he spoke up. "There's a place," he said slowly. "Up valley, where the 3 streams converge before they join the main river. High enough to be safe, but with good access to water and fertile ground. You've scouted it." "Asked Einar. I've been thinking about it for years, actually. Before the flood. It would be a good place for a settlement, defensible, with natural resources nearby." He paused, as if revealing more than he had intended. "I used to imagine what it would be like to build something there, something permanent." Brynja studied his face in the firelight, seeing a vulnerability she hadn't expected. The idea that he had been dreaming of home, of putting down roots, challenged her assumptions about the solitary warrior who lived apart from community. "Show us," she said simply. The next morning, a small group made the journey to the site Jorund had described. It was everything he had promised. A natural terrace overlooking the valley, with fresh water springs and stands of mature timber nearby. More importantly, it felt right in a way that was hard to define. Protected but not isolated, elevated but accessible. "We could build better here," Einar said, already visualizing the layout. "Plan the settlement properly from the beginning. Houses that could withstand another flood," added Sigrid. Raised foundations, proper drainage. As they explored the site, marking potential locations for houses and workshops, Brynja found herself walking beside Jorund. "Is this what you imagined?" she asked. "When you used to think about building here?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the landscape with the careful attention of someone mapping possibilities. "I always imagined it empty," he said finally. "Just me, maybe a few animals. Quiet. And now he turned to look at her, something warm and complicated in his expression. Now I think quiet might be overrated. Standing there in the place that might become their new home, surrounded by the voices of people planning and hoping together. Brynja felt something she hadn't experienced since before the flood, a sense of future stretching ahead, full of possibility rather than mere survival. The attack came at dawn, when most of the survivors were still sleeping in their makeshift shelters. Brynja woke to the sound of horses splashing through the shallow water and harsh voices shouting commands in a dialect she didn't recognize. Through the gaps in her shelter's walls, she saw armed men dismounting, their leather armor and weapons marking them as raiders rather than rescuers. Everyone out. The leader's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements, Brynja's heart hammered as she emerged into the grey morning light. Around her, the other survivors stumbled from their shelters, confusion and fear written across their faces. The children pressed close to their mothers, sensing danger, even if they didn't understand its nature. There were 8 raiders, she counted quickly. Well-armed, well-fed, moving with the confidence of men who had done this many times before. Their leader was a lean man with greying hair and cold eyes that assessed the camp with the calculation of a merchant evaluating goods. "My name is Thorvald," he announced, his gaze moving across the assembled survivors. "Some of you may have heard of me." Brynja had indeed heard the name whispered in taverns and market squares, a bandit lord who preyed on isolated settlements, taking what he wanted and burning what he couldn't carry. But Thorvald had always operated far to the north, beyond the reach of organized resistance. The flood must have driven him south, seeking easier prey among the scattered survivors. "We're not here to hurt anyone," Thorvald continued, his tone almost conversational. "We're here to collect taxes. Protection fees, you might call them. The world's become dangerous lately, and you need someone to watch over you." "We have nothing," protested Einar, stepping forward despite the weapons pointed in his direction. "The flood took everything. We're barely surviving ourselves." Thorvald's smile was thin and cold. "Oh, but you do have something. You have strong backs, useful skills. Some of you will come with us to work off your debt. Others will stay here and gather tribute for our next visit." The silence that followed was broken by Astrid's sharp intake of breath. Brynja turned to see her friend doubled over, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, her face pale with more than fear. "The baby," Astrid whispered. "It's coming. The timing couldn't have been worse." In the middle of a crisis that threatened everyone's freedom, new life was demanding to make its entrance. Brynja moved instinctively toward her friend, but one of the raiders stepped into her path. "Nobody moves without permission," he growled. That's when Jorund spoke for the first time since the raiders had arrived. "Let her help with the birth." His voice was calm, but Brynja could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. "You gain nothing by letting a woman and child die." Thorvald turned his attention to Jorund, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "And you are?" "Nobody important, just another survivor." But Thorvald was studying him with the intensity of a man who recognized a fellow predator. "I don't think so. You move like a warrior. Hold yourself like someone accustomed to command. What's your real name?" Jorund met his gaze steadily, saying nothing. "Search him," Thorvald ordered. The raiders moved in quickly, professional in their efficiency. When they pulled back Jorund's cloak, revealing the battle-worn leather beneath, Thorvald's eyes narrowed. But it was the medallion they found around his neck that made the bandit leader step back in surprise. Brynja had never seen the medallion before, a disc of silver bearing the image of a raven in flight. It meant nothing to her, but clearly meant something significant to Thorvald. "Well, well," the bandit leader murmured. "Jorund Ravenshield. I wondered what had become of you." The name sent a chill through Brynja. Not just Jorund, but Jorund Ravenshield. A name that carried weight even in these remote valleys. She had heard it spoken in hushed tones by traveling merchants and wandering warriors, always with a mixture of respect and fear. "You're supposed to be dead," Thorvald continued. "Killed in the siege of Drakmir, so the stories go. Stories often lie, Jorund replied quietly. Thorvald laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Indeed they do, but here you are, hiding among sheep farmers and healers. How the mighty have fallen. Brynja felt the ground shifting beneath her feet in ways that had nothing to do with the unstable mud. The man she had come to know, gentle, thoughtful, careful with his strength, was apparently someone else entirely. Someone whose very name made hardened raiders recalculate their plans. Around them, the other survivors were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something larger than a simple raid. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste like the moment before lightning strikes. This changes things, Thorvald mused. Jorund Ravenshield as a captive would be worth more than this entire settlement. There are people who would pay handsomely for the chance to settle old accounts. Astrid's labored breathing drew everyone's attention back to the immediate crisis. Her contractions were coming faster now, and she could no longer stand without support. "Please," Brynja said, addressing Thorvald directly, "whatever history you have with him, it doesn't involve the rest of us. Let me help her. This baby won't wait for your negotiations." For a moment she thought he would refuse. But then he gestured to two of his men. "Watch them. Any sudden movements, any attempts at escape, and you kill everyone else first. Ravenshield values other people's lives too much for his own good. Always was his weakness." As Brynja helped Astrid toward a more private shelter, her mind raced with questions she couldn't voice. Who was Jorund really? What had he done to earn such a fearsome reputation? And why had he hidden his identity so completely that even she, who had begun to trust him with her life, had no idea of his true nature? But as they settled Astrid into the birthing position, all other concerns faded. Whatever secrets surrounded Jorund, whatever dangers threatened from the outside, her focus narrowed to the ancient struggle happening in front of her. Life was demanding its due, and everything else would have to wait. Through the thin walls of the shelter, she could hear Thorvald and Jorund speaking in low voices, negotiating terms that would determine the fate of everyone in the camp. The conversation was too quiet to make out words, but the tone suggested a delicate balance of threats and bargaining. "Something's wrong," Astrid gasped, pulling Brynja's attention back to the birth. "The baby, it's not coming right." Brynja examined her friend quickly, her heart sinking as she confirmed what she had feared. The baby was presenting breech, buttocks first instead of head down. Without proper tools or experience, this kind of delivery could easily kill both mother and child. Outside, she could hear the conversation between Jorund and Thorvald growing more heated. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't going well. Soon, decisions would be made that would change everything for everyone in the camp. But first, she had to save 2 lives with nothing but her hands and whatever knowledge she could summon from years of watching her grandmother work. As she prepared to attempt the most difficult delivery of her career, Brynja realized that the next few hours would test everything she had learned about healing, courage, and the strength that comes from refusing to give up when everything seems impossible. Inside the makeshift birthing shelter, Brynja worked with steady hands, despite the chaos erupting around them. Astrid's labor had intensified, but the baby's breech presentation made every contraction a dangerous gamble. Outside, she could hear Thorvald's voice growing more demanding, Jorund's responses becoming shorter and more clipped. "Tell me what to do," whispered Sigrid, who had managed to slip into the shelter to help. "I've had 3 children, but never like this." Brynja's mind raced through everything her grandmother had taught her about difficult births. The baby needed to be turned, but without the right position, attempting to do so could cause injury or death. She pressed her hands gently against Astrid's belly, feeling for the child's position, trying to visualize what she couldn't see. "The baby's too far down to turn safely," she murmured. "We'll have to deliver breech and hope for the best." Astrid gripped her hand with crushing force as another contraction hit. "My mother died in childbirth," she gasped. "Her mother too." "What if—" "Don't think about that," Brynja said firmly. "Think about holding your baby. Think about teaching them to walk, to laugh, to catch fish in the streams. You're going to live to see all of it. But even as she spoke the words of comfort, doubt gnawed at her. Without proper tools, without the medicines that could ease labor and prevent bleeding, she was attempting something that challenged even experienced midwives. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared for the next phase of delivery. Outside, the negotiation had reached a critical point. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thorvald's ultimatum clearly. Here's my final offer, Ravenshield. You come with us willingly, and I let the others go about their business. Maybe we take a few supplies, but no one gets hurt. You refuse, and I take half these people as slaves and burn the rest out of spite. Jorund's response was too quiet to hear, but the tone carried resignation. Brynja felt her heart clench as she realized what he was prepared to sacrifice for their safety. The man who had spent weeks helping rebuild their community, who had shared his knowledge and skills freely, was about to surrender himself to protect people who had barely accepted him. There's another way, came a new voice. Einar, speaking up despite the weapons trained on him. You want tribute? We can give you tribute, not people but goods. We know where the old village's treasury was hidden. Brynja held her breath. There had indeed been a treasury of sorts, not gold or silver, but valuable goods that the village had accumulated for trade. Tools, preserved foods, crafted items that could be worth significant coin in the right markets. The flood had buried it, but the location could be found. Interesting, Thorvald mused. But how do I know you're not lying? Because I helped bury it, Einar replied. 20 years ago, when raiders threatened us before. We've learned to hide what matters most. Another contraction racked Astrid's body, this one stronger than any before. Brynja could see the baby beginning to crown buttocks first, as she'd feared. The most dangerous part of the delivery was beginning. I need you to push, but carefully, she instructed Astrid. Small pushes. Let the baby come slowly. As she worked to guide the infant safely into the world, part of her attention remained focused on the conversation outside. Thorvald seemed interested in Einar's offer, but she could hear the skepticism in his voice. Even if this treasury exists, the bandit leader said, what guarantee do I have that you'll lead me to it? What's to stop you from taking my men into a trap? Take me as hostage, Einar offered. If the treasury isn't where I say it is, if it isn't worth what I claim, then you have your revenge and my life as compensation. The boldness of the offer surprised even Brynja. Einar was risking everything on the chance that the village's hidden wealth could buy their freedom. But would it be enough to satisfy Thorvald's greed, or would he simply take both the treasure and Jorund? Inside the shelter, the baby's buttocks and legs had emerged, but the head remained trapped. This was the moment of greatest danger. If the umbilical cord was compressed for too long, the child could be lost. Brynja's hands worked with desperate precision, trying to ease the baby's shoulders through without causing injury. Something's wrong, Astrid panted. I can feel it. Brynja could feel it too. The baby wasn't breathing yet, and the cord was indeed compressed. She had perhaps minutes to complete the delivery before the lack of oxygen caused permanent damage or death. Sigrid, I need you to support Astrid's back, she commanded, her voice taking on the authority she'd learned from years of medical crises. Help her lean forward. As Sigrid moved to comply, Brynja worked to free the baby's arms, which were trapped against its body. Each second felt like an hour as she maneuvered carefully, knowing that one wrong move could break tiny bones or worse. Outside, the negotiation had taken a new turn. Thorvald was interested in the treasury, but his price had increased. The treasure, plus the famous Jorund Ravenshield, he declared. Both, or I take half your people and leave the rest to starve. That wasn't the deal, Einar protested. I'm changing the deal. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Brynja heard Jorund speak again, his voice carrying across the camp with quiet authority. There's something you should know about that treasury, Thorvald. About what else is buried with it. More treasure, information, documents that certain people would pay well to keep buried. Records of raids, of ships taken, of nobles who secretly funded piracy operations along the northern coasts. The silence that followed was telling. Brynja realized that Jorund was using his knowledge of the criminal underworld, leveraging secrets that could be as valuable as gold to the right people. "You're bluffing," Thorvald said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I? How well do you think Lord Eriksson would sleep, knowing that his financing of your raids might become public knowledge? How long do you think you'd survive once King Magnus learned about your arrangement with his cousin?" Even focused on the delivery, Brynja could hear the shift in the raiders' mood. These were men who lived by violence, but they also understood the value of information. If Jorund was telling the truth about compromising documents, the treasury represented more than just immediate wealth. It offered leverage over powerful people. Finally, miraculously, the baby's head emerged. But the infant was blue and still, not breathing. Brynja quickly cleared the mouth and nose, then began the gentle stimulation that sometimes revived newborns who had suffered during difficult deliveries. "Why isn't it crying?" Astrid asked weakly. "Sometimes they need a moment," Brynja replied, though her own heart was racing with fear. She rubbed the baby's back, tapped its feet, trying everything she knew to encourage that first vital breath. Outside, Thorvald had apparently made his decision. "Very well, Ravenshield. I'll take the treasury and its secrets instead of you. But I want half its value as tribute, and I want maps to similar hidden stores in other settlements. This region is going to be very profitable for me." "Agreed," Jorund said. "But the woman giving birth, she needs time. We don't move anyone until the child is safely delivered." "You have 1 hour," Thorvald replied. "Then we go find this treasure, with or without her recovery." As if summoned by the deadline, the baby suddenly drew its first shuddering breath and let out a weak but determined cry. Relief flooded through Brynja as the infant's color began to improve. Small fists waving as lungs filled with air for the first time. "A girl," she announced, wrapping the baby in the cleanest cloth they had. Small but strong, just like her mother. As she placed the baby in Astrid's arms, tears of exhaustion and joy streaming down both their faces, Brynja felt a complex mixture of triumph and foreboding. They had saved 2 lives, but the larger crisis was far from over. In less than an hour, Jorund would lead armed strangers to the village's most precious secrets, gambling everything on his ability to satisfy their greed without betraying his people's trust. The baby's cries grew stronger, a sound of life and hope that carried across the camp, reminding everyone what they were fighting to protect. But as Brynja cleaned up from the delivery and prepared to face whatever came next, she couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The treasury lay buried beneath what had once been the village's central square, now a muddy expanse dotted with the broken foundations of familiar buildings. Jorund led the way, followed by Thorvald and 4 of his men, while the remaining raiders stayed behind to watch the survivors. Brynja had insisted on coming despite the danger, claiming that her knowledge of the village layout was needed to locate the exact spot. In truth, she couldn't bear to let Jorund face this alone. The revelation of his identity as Jorund Ravenshield had shaken her, but not in the way she might have expected. Instead of fear or betrayal, she felt a deeper understanding of the burdens he carried, the weight of a reputation that followed him wherever he went. "Here," Einar said, pointing to a spot where 2 stone markers still protruded above the mud. 20 paces north from the old well, 10 paces east from the baker's cornerstone. Thorvald's men began digging immediately, their shovels striking the waterlogged ground with wet, sucking sounds. The work was slow and treacherous. The flood had left the earth unstable, prone to collapse, and every shovelful had to be carefully placed to avoid cave-ins. "You know," Thorvald said conversationally as his men worked, "I'm curious about something, Ravenshield. Why disappear? Why let everyone think you were dead? A man with your reputation could have claimed lordship over 6 settlements." Jorund stood with his arms crossed, watching the excavation with apparent calm. But Brynja could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for threats or opportunities. "Power attracts the wrong kind of attention," he replied. Eventually, someone always comes along who thinks they can take it from you. Wise words. But hiding among farmers and fishermen, that seems beneath a man of your talents. These people work honestly for what they have. They build things instead of taking them. It's not beneath me, it's better than me. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Brynja understood now why he had chosen isolation, why he had been so careful to remain apart from the community, even while protecting it. He wasn't just hiding from his enemies, he was trying to escape from himself, one of the diggers called out excitedly. His shovel had struck something solid, something that rang with the sound of metal against stone. Within minutes, they had uncovered the corner of a wooden chest, its iron binding still intact, despite years underground and weeks underwater. Careful now, Einar warned. The wood may be rotted. We need to lift it whole if possible. But as they worked to clear around the chest, another sound reached them, the thunder of approaching horses, moving fast across the muddy landscape. Thorvald's expression darkened as he counted the riders. 8 men, he muttered, moving like they have purpose. Jorund's posture changed instantly, shifting from wary cooperation to deadly alertness. Friends of yours? No one I was expecting. Thorvald drew his sword, signaling his men to defensive positions. Could be competitors, could be lawmen. Either way, they're not welcome. As the riders drew closer, Brynja could see they wore the colors of the regional lord, King Magnus's men, probably sent to assess flood damage and restore order. Their timing couldn't have been worse, arriving just as the treasury was being unearthed by known criminals. We could all die here, Thorvald said grimly. Royal soldiers don't take prisoners when they find raiders with stolen goods. The goods aren't stolen, Einar pointed out. This is our village treasury, buried by our own people. Try explaining that while they're putting arrows through your chest. The approaching soldiers had spotted them now, and their formation shifted into attack pattern. 8 against 5 weren't terrible odds for experienced fighters. But the presence of civilians, including Brynja, complicated any defensive strategy. Jorund stepped forward, his hand moving to the medallion at his throat. There might be another way, he said quietly. But it means revealing who I am to the wrong people, as opposed to dying anonymously in the mud. Thorvald replied. The chest was finally free, its weight requiring 2 men to lift. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were the accumulated treasures of 3 generations. Silver coins, crafted jewelry, valuable tools, and yes, the documents Jorund had promised. Ledgers and letters that detailed illegal activities across the northern kingdoms. Information that could topple governments or destroy reputations. Whatever you're going to do, Thorvald said urgently, do it now. Those soldiers will be here in minutes. Jorund pulled the medallion over his head, holding it high where it would catch the light. The silver raven seemed to gleam with its own inner fire as he stepped into clear view of the approaching riders. I am Jorund Ravenshield, he called out, his voice carrying across the muddy expanse with unmistakable authority. I claim right of parley under the old laws. The effect was immediate. The lead rider raised his hand, bringing the formation to a halt just outside arrow range. For long moments, nothing moved except the wind across the desolate landscape and the nervous shifting of horses. Finally, the lead rider spurred his mount forward, approaching alone with his weapon sheathed but ready. As he drew nearer, Brynja could see he was a man of middle years, scarred by experience and wearing the insignia of a royal captain. Jorund Ravenshield died at Drakmere, the captain called out. Every man in the kingdom knows that story. Stories often serve purposes beyond truth, Jorund replied. Would you like to test whether this one serves yours? The royal captain dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his sword hilt as he approached Jorund. His weathered face showed the kind of skepticism that came from years of dealing with impostors and false claims. Captain Hakon, he introduced himself formally. If you are truly Jorund Ravenshield, then you'll know what happened at the Battle of Thornfield. Jorund's expression didn't change, but Brynja saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the weight of unwelcome memories. I led the rearguard action that allowed King Magnus's retreat. Lost 300 good men buying time for a king who never thanked us for the sacrifice. The captain's posture shifted slightly, doubt beginning to replace certainty. Anyone could have heard that story. The king's horse threw a shoe that morning, Jorund continued quietly. You gave him yours, a grey mare named Freydis that you'd raised from a foal. Magnus never knew about that trade, but you limped for 2 days afterward because your replacement mount was too tall. Captain Hakon's hand fell away from his weapon. God's blood, he whispered. You are alive. The tension between the soldiers and raiders remained thick, but the immediate threat of violence had diminished. Thorvald watched the exchange with calculating eyes, clearly reassessing his position now that Jorund's identity was confirmed by royal recognition. This complicates things, the bandit leader muttered. It simplifies them, Jorund replied. His attention still focused on Captain Hakon. These people are survivors of the flood that destroyed Vestfjord. They're recovering their own property from their village treasury. No laws have been broken, and the armed men with them. Hakon asked pointedly, gesturing toward Thorvald's raiders. It was a critical moment. Jorund could expose Thorvald as a bandit, probably ensuring the raiders' deaths or capture. But he could also find a way to defuse the situation that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Brynja held her breath, watching him weigh lives against justice. Mercenaries, Jorund said finally, hired to provide protection during the recovery operation. The region has become dangerous since the floods. Desperate people do desperate things. Thorvald's eyebrows rose at this unexpected reprieve, but he had the wisdom to remain silent. His men followed his lead, adopting the relaxed posture of hired guards rather than aggressive raiders. Captain Hakon studied the scene carefully. The muddy excavation, the recovered chest, the obvious signs of long-term survival efforts. The Crown is concerned about maintaining order in the flood regions, he said slowly. There have been reports of banditry, of settlements going missing entirely, which is why these people need protection, Jorund replied smoothly. They're planning to rebuild, to establish a new settlement on higher ground. But they'll need time and security to do it properly. And you? What's your role in this? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Jorund could claim many things: leadership, protection, temporary assistance. What he chose would determine not just his immediate fate, but the future of everyone who depended on him. I'm helping them build something better than what they lost, he said simply. A community that can withstand whatever challenges come next. Brynja felt her heart skip as she heard the commitment in his voice. Not just temporary aid, not just protection until the crisis passed, but a genuine intention to stay, to become part of what they were building together. Captain Hakon nodded slowly. The king values stability. Settlements that can govern themselves, protect themselves, contribute to the kingdom's strength. He paused, considering. There might be official recognition in this. A charter, perhaps. Legal protection for your new settlement. In exchange for information, reports on conditions in the region. Early warning if real bandits or foreign raiders move through your territory. Hakon glanced meaningfully at Thorvald. And assurance that your mercenaries understand the difference between protection and predation. Thorvald stepped forward then, reading the currents of the conversation with a bandit's keen instinct for survival. My men and I are always willing to serve the Crown's interests, he said carefully. For appropriate compensation, of course. It was a masterful bit of maneuvering. Instead of being arrested or killed as raiders, Thorvald's men were being offered the chance to become legitimate hired swords, protecting the very settlements they might otherwise have plundered. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Then we have an understanding, Captain Hakon said. I'll report to the king that the Vestfjord survivors have established a new settlement under the protection of Jorund Ravenshield, with adequate security arrangements in place, as the soldiers prepared to depart, taking with them several of the compromising documents as evidence of their successful diplomatic mission. Brynja found herself standing beside Jorund in the ruins of her old world, watching the birth of something entirely new. So, she said quietly, Jorund Ravenshield decides to stay among the farmers and fishermen after all. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile held no shadows. Jorund Ravenshield was a man who lived for war, he replied. I'd rather be someone who lives for peace. The transformation was complete. The legend had become a man, the warrior had chosen to be a builder, and the community that had emerged from the flood was stronger for having survived its greatest test. 6 months later, the settlement that would come to be known as Vestfjord bore little resemblance to the desperate camp of flood survivors that had clung to muddy hilltops through the dark days of early autumn. Houses built on raised foundations lined carefully planned streets, their walls thick enough to withstand winter storms, and their roofs designed to shed the heaviest rains. Gardens flourished in the fertile soil that the receding waters had left behind, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the new school that Einar had built with timber from the upstream forests. Brynja stood in the doorway of her healing house, watching the morning life of the community unfold before her. The building was larger than her old cottage had been, with separate rooms for different kinds of treatment and storage space for the medicines she was slowly rebuilding from memory and experimentation. But more than that, it was positioned at the heart of the settlement, accessible to everyone, a symbol of the community's commitment to caring for its own. Her herb garden was her greatest pride, not just because of the plants themselves, but because of who had helped her plan and tend it. Jorund had spent weeks with her, discussing which varieties would grow best in the new soil, how to arrange them for maximum yield, where to place the paths that would allow easy access during harvests. His knowledge of cultivation, gained from years of solitary living, had proven as valuable as his skills in construction and organization. The sound of hammering drew her attention to the new workshop being built near the settlement's edge. Thorvald, now officially Captain Thorvald of the Vestfjord Guard, supervised a crew of his former raiders as they erected walls for what would become their barracks and training ground. The transformation of bandit into protector had not been without challenges, but the promise of steady pay and legitimate purpose had proven more attractive than the uncertain rewards of raiding. "Strange world," said a familiar voice beside her. Astrid approached carrying her daughter, now 6 months old and thriving, despite her difficult entrance into the world. Little Sigrid, named for the woman who had helped at her birth, gurgled happily as she watched the busy street scene, her bright eyes tracking movement with the intense curiosity of the very young. "Strange, but good," Brynja agreed, reaching out to stroke the baby's soft hair. The child had become something of a symbol for the entire community, proof that life could emerge from the darkest circumstances. That hope was always justified, even when it seemed impossible. "Have you seen Jorund this morning?" Astrid asked. "Henrik's been asking for him. Something about the new bridge plans." Brynja nodded toward the river, where construction had begun on a stone bridge that would connect their settlement to the trade routes beyond the valley. "He's down there arguing with the stonemasons about foundation depth again. It had become a familiar pattern." Jorund approached every project with the thoroughness of someone who understood that lives depended on getting the details right. Whether it was the placement of drainage channels or the thickness of defensive walls, he insisted on building for permanence, for the kind of stability that could weather any storm. The official charter from King Magnus had arrived 3 weeks ago, formally recognizing Vestfjord as a settlement under royal protection and appointing Jorund as its official leader. The title came with responsibilities: tax collection, military service, maintaining roads and trade routes, but also with benefits: legal protection, access to royal markets, and the kind of legitimacy that discouraged casual raiders from testing their defenses. But the real test of leadership wasn't written in royal documents. It was visible in the way people approached Jorund with their problems, confident that he would listen and find solutions. In the way children ran to him when they skinned their knees, knowing he would clean the wound and apply just the right amount of sympathy. in the way the evening councils had evolved from desperate survival planning into genuine community governance, with decisions made by consensus and implementation guided by shared purpose. "Brynja?" Astrid's voice broke through her reverie. "There's something I wanted to ask you. About Jorund. What about him? Are you going to marry him?" The question shouldn't have surprised her. Everyone in the settlement had been watching their relationship develop with the kind of benevolent interest that small communities took in their neighbors' romantic lives. But hearing it spoken aloud still made her heart skip. "He hasn't asked," she replied carefully. "Have you?" That was a thought that would have been scandalous 6 months ago, when the old rules still governed their lives. But the flood had washed away more than buildings. It had swept aside many of the conventions that had once seemed immutable. Women in Vestfjord spoke their minds, made their own choices, and took active roles in shaping their community's future. "Maybe I will," Brynja said, surprised by her own boldness. As if summoned by their conversation, Jorund appeared at the end of the street, walking up from the river with his characteristic purposeful stride. But something was different about his expression. Today, a mixture of nervousness and determination that she'd seen before only in moments of crisis. He approached them with a formal sort of carefulness that immediately put both women on alert. "Brynja," he said, "could I speak with you?" "Privately?" Astrid grinned and stepped back, making an exaggerated show of giving them space. "I'll just take Sigrid to see the new calf that was born yesterday." When they were alone, Jorund seemed to struggle for words. Finally, he reached into his tunic and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth, the kind of careful packaging that suggested something precious. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. "No, that's not right. I've been planning, for weeks now, planning what to say, how to ask." He unwrapped the object, revealing a ring carved from silver, its surface decorated with intricate knotwork that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and considerable time. "Brynja," he said, his voice steadier now, "you saved me from more than the flood. You saved me from a life I didn't know was drowning me. Will you help me build something better than either of us could create alone?" Looking at him, this man who had hidden his strength to protect others, who had chosen healing over hurting, who had built a community from the wreckage of catastrophe, she felt the same certainty that had guided her through the darkest moments of the flood. "Yes," she said simply, and the word seemed to contain all the hope and promise of their new world.